We have always been a people willing to risk bettering our lives and the lives of future generations to find that new place, that opportunity, that welcoming community, home. Italians were part of the great wave of European immigrants to America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We came to escape poverty, to find our fortunes, and to claim a new start.
Me, I was happy. I want to get the hell out of there.
Calabria is the southernmost region of mainland Italy. Up to 80% of the immigrants that left Italy came from the south. We see towns that don't have indoor plumbing, they don't have electricity, they don't have access to education. We see in Calabria a lot of poverty, a lot of hunger. We also see natural disaster and disease. They were functioning in almost a feudal-like system, which meant that the people didn't own the land that they lived on, the land that they cultivated. So a portion of what they grew went to the owners of the land. So at the end of the day, what was left for them was very little.
America was a land in need of workers, and Calabria had many people who wanted a chance to do the jobs that needed to be done. American companies sent recruiters to Italy looking for people to fill the jobs.
So you have to be a farmer, and they treat you like dirt, or you have to have a business of your own.
In 1898, the city of Monessen was formed in Westmoreland County, named for the Monongahela River, and the city of Essen in Germany. Because of the natural resources of the area, like the river and coal, industry was springing up in Monessen, including a tin mill and steel mill. The mills needed workers that exceeded the supply of what was available locally.
The mills would send agents to the old country to recruit workers. Pittsburgh Steel seemed to be a company that favored hiring Italians. The tin mill favored Finnish people.
And many of the Italian immigrants that came at that time are lured with the promise of the gold-paved streets in America.
The streets were not paved in gold, as many of the immigrants were led to believe, but Monessen had the nickname Mud Essen. Mud was everywhere. Planks were thrown across for sidewalks and across the road so the women could get across with their long hoop skirts.
Luigi Mandarino was working in Monessen at Pittsburgh Steel and was sending money to his wife, Maria, and their children in Cherisano until he could buy steamship tickets for them to join him. For now, Luigi and Maria's son Anthony traveled to Monessen in 1905 so he could look for a job.
He was 16 years old. He and his brother Francesco Mandarino, who was 21, sailed on the SS Calabria. They arrived in New York on the 13th of May after a 15-day voyage.
Because most of the immigrants couldn't afford to travel anything other than third class, they are in the steerage of the ship, which means that it's a subterranean existence for them. Besides having the rough seas, you also have the anxiety of being on the ocean, going to a destination where you don't know what it's going to be like. And for many people, they could not wait to see the Statue of Liberty because that was the sign that this part of the journey was over.
The Statue of Liberty was the beacon of hope. Weary travelers had arrived in a new home where they could begin working to create a new and better life.
He knew they needed carpenters, so he got carpenter's tools. And I think it was like a level or something, whatever it was, he carried it, and he went and they were asking if he had experience, and he just, whatever they said, he shook his head. And he became what I understand to be one of the best carpenters they had at the mill, the Monessen mill.
In July of 1909, Maria Leneve, 46, sailed on the SS Critic with her 6 Mandarino children. Anthony moved into the house with his parents. He was living in the house on the census record. He was 21 years old. He was working as a carpenter. He was the first member of the family to speak English. The other folks in the family on the census record were speaking Italian.
I don't think there were any slackers in that generation at all, let alone in the Mandarino family. They knew they had to work. And if they weren't satisfied with what they were doing, they just picked up and went elsewhere until they found work.
But it was going to take a lot more than hard work to survive in America.
Me, they call me a Dago. I'm a Dago. I'm an Italian guy from Italy.
Yes, yes. There were time my dad was a salesman, and if it happened to him, I imagine it happened to the others. He didn't get accounts because he was Italian.
One form of discrimination was how much Italians were paid for the work they did.
Italians were paid less than other nationalities in the early days of the industry in the local area. There was a study done in 1910 by the United States government on the Pittsburgh area on immigrants in industry, the iron and steel manufacturing aspects, and they studied the average earnings per week. French men received $20.79. From England, they received $17.40. Germans, $17.13. Polish, $12.21. North Italian men, $12.01. South Italian men, $11.83. Croatians, $11.46. So as you go through these figures, you can see that many of the Italians were paid lower than some other nationalities.
Anthony understood that you had to make things happen. You couldn't be passive about it. You had to learn to read. You had to learn to speak English. When it became a matter of becoming a laborer and making $1.65 a day, he opted to learn a carpenter's trade and make more money. Anthony learned to speak English very early. He got his citizenship papers. In 1925, he got a passport. His reason to get a passport was because he was going back to Italy to get married.
Traveling back to Cerisano, the village of his birthplace, Anthony would learn of a family with eligible daughters, and he would choose Angelina.
That's not unusual at all to go back to your home village in order to find a spouse. So often we see that when a young man is of marrying age, he would go back to Italy in order to marry.
On the 9th of September, he married Angelina Rita. They departed Italy the following January the 10th. They sailed on the SS Martha Washington for a return trip to get back to Monessen.
Anthony and Angelina started their family in 1927 with the birth of their daughter Mary. The Great Depression started just as their second child, Louis, was born in 1929. The U.S. Census provides insight into Anthony and Angelina's life.
10 years later, in April of 1940, they're at 317 6th Street in Monessen. Anthony's house was valued at $8,000, and he rented a portion to 3 families. He and his wife have 6 children: Mary, who is 12, Louis, who's 10, James is 7, Josephine is 6, Betty Lou is 3, and Bobby is only 3 months old.
Oh yes, you would definitely know. They always spoke in Italian, but if a stranger was around, the English would come out very broken, and they would be very apologetic.
She would take the kids in that went to the high school, junior high and high school, in for lunch all the time. She wanted to take as many of the youngsters in, but they were very, I can't emphasize enough that they were very kind. They were very kind.
The Mandarinos raised their children in Monessen at a time when Pittsburgh Steel was operating at full capacity and Monessen was a boom town. A key difference in raising sons and daughters at that time was the value placed by some in educating their sons, but not their daughters.
My mom graduated in '44, but she had gone to school with a class of '45 because she had skipped the 11th grade. And she did get offered a scholarship to California, and she didn't accept it because her parents thought that only the men should be educated, not the women. The dean, somebody from the college actually came and asked them to reconsider, but they wouldn't. So.
No, no. The men looked on the bit that the women were going to eventually marry, or there were certain things they could go into, like you could be a nurse. It was accepted that maybe you could be a secretary, maybe an aide at the hospital. They didn't look at girls having education. When my dad decided it was fine for me to go to college, because I wanted to go to college, and he wanted me to go to college.
Anthony and Angelina were devout Catholics who wanted their 3 sons to receive a Catholic education.
At that time, that might have been their only choice because it was a Catholic school. And oftentimes we find that Italians who are seeking higher education only are accepted within Catholic universities or Catholic colleges. A non-Catholic university may have not accepted them based on their ethnicity.
All 3 sons, Lou, Jim, and Bobby, would study at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. While all 6 of the children would do well in life, Lou and Jim would go into law and have political careers that would raise the bar for exceptional standards of achievement and accomplishment.
Here's this guy graduates from St. Vincent College, and he gets in Harvard. He gets in Harvard because he's smart. And he goes up there, and he was not a traditional Harvard student back then. Traditional Harvard students back then were all men of privilege, and he was not. He worked in an Italian restaurant, he made money, and he persevered, and he did well, and he was a Harvard law graduate. I mean, Jim did about the same thing. Jim went to the University of Michigan, which was very prestigious, you know? I think about how brave those 2 fellows were to take those leaps.
In order to go to those 2 law schools, they would have had a lot of natural ability. There's just no way you can survive, be admitted to and survive in the law schools that they attended without being very, very bright.
After graduating from prestigious law schools, Lou and Jim both returned to their hometown of Monessen and worked together in their own law firm. Dedicated to public service from the start, Lou served on Monessen City Council and decides to run for mayor against the powerful Hugo Parenti. In the 1960s, when steel manufacturing was at its peak, Lou ran on a platform of wanting to diversify industry and also bring a junior college to Monessen.
One thing that was important is he was trying to get more industry because all we had was one steel mill. And that's how brilliant he was. He knew eventually that if we ever lost that, we'd lose everything, and we did.
Lou would meet President John F. Kennedy in the Monessen City Chambers on October 13, 1962, when the president was on the road stumping for Democrats in the midterm election. Lou would lose the race for mayor, but he'd never give up on Monessen. Lou loved a lot about academia and always loved reading.
Never. We had a driver, and sometimes the law clerks would drive, and sometimes I would drive, but he never, ever drove.
Why not?
I don't think he ever liked to drive. That was the main reason, and then he was always busy reading something, so he never drove.
The story I heard about Uncle Lou when he was there, that I guess back then they were very strict with lights out at 10 o'clock, and they said they would find him in the closet under a blanket still trying to read with a flashlight after hours.
And it wasn't reading. I said, Lou, would you let me have your head for about 5 minutes so I can be back, get down over there? What's wrong with you? Can you do it about me moving? No, I said no. He started arguing with me. Anyway, I took the heck off. Get the hell, I go across the street, that's all. I ain't gonna cut your head no more. Jimmy, he said, he come over, he said, you did a wonderful thing for my brother. He was happy.
Lou was a standout law professor in the Duquesne University School of Law, where several things converged: his love of reading, teaching, and once again, being part of a value and ethics-based institution that fosters the principles of Catholic education.
He was one of the best professors I ever had. He had this loud, booming voice. He just would pose so many different questions to the law students because we had the Socratic method, and he would just keep you on your heels the whole time you were in his class.
At that same time, students here at the law school knew there was going to be a dean change, and they lobbied the university to have Professor Mandarino named the Dean of the School of Law.
When the deanship space was vacant, the students insisted that it be Lou. I mean, I remember the guys who were older than me gathering and going to administration and just not going to be satisfied until this appointment was made.
And Professor Mandarino became Dean Mandarino for 2 years, 1968 through 1970.
There had been a lot of talk about redoing Pennsylvania's Constitution for many years, and finally the electorate agreed that there would be a constitutional convention and delegates would prepare this new Constitution, which was quite a big deal. He loved politics, he loved the law, and for him to participate in the making of a new Constitution must have been very similar to how our founding fathers felt back in 1776. And here was Lou creating our new Constitution.
Soon, Dean Mandarino was tapped to be a judge on the Commonwealth Court and an inaugural judge, one of the first judges on the first segment of judges for the Commonwealth Court. So we have a wonderful experience of a man who not only touched our students, but was able to touch our students after they graduated and get them launched on their career.
And we spent the first year of my clerkship setting up chambers both in Harrisburg and in Monessen, because he felt it very important to have chambers in his hometown so that it could be recognized. Lou, with I'm sure Jim's encouragement and political expertise, decided to run for the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. A daunting experience. But Lou was the first really down-to-earth kind of guy to run. I really believe that from my knowledge of who the other justices were. He was more grassroots than anybody had ever been. I still remember election night. We were at Lou's house up on Grandview Avenue in Monessen, and the calls that came in from all these important political figures across the United States of America, Georgia McGovern calling and people like that. It was really kind of amazing. It was quite an experience. So I was off for my second year of the clerkship to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, and I found out when I was there that I was the first woman to ever clerk on that court. Amazing, wasn't it?
When I was a law student at Duquesne, I had done very well. I was at the top of the class. I was the first person to graduate summa cum laude from Duquesne University School of Law. The justice was very committed to our criminal justice system, and he thought it was extremely important for indigent defendants to have legal representation. And he always remarked, that it was one of the compelling things about our society that we did have a right to counsel in criminal cases, because without that, it's such an unlevel playing field that you would not be able to have due process. And he was very committed and passionate about that.
So I went and I sent him my resume and asked to have an interview with him, and that's the first really heart-to-heart talk I ever had with him. And I remember, you know, family was very important to him because and I think the reason I got the job. Now, I had done well in law school, but a lot of people do well in law school, and there are a lot of applicants for that job. And he said to me, "Why do you want this?" And I said, "Well, you know, I'm first generation college student in my family, and certainly the first person to go to law school in my family. And my parents would be so proud." Now, whenever we travel, and I would, you know, the clerks traveled with him, you know, he was Mr. Justice Mandarino, Mr. Justice Mandarino. But in Monessen, he was always just Lou to everyone. He had a sign on one of his boards in the office where he had a lot of accolades posted. And one was the award from IBM. And I said, you got this IBM award from, I thought it was, you know, IBM. He says, "Oh," he says, "No, that's not IBM." He says, "That's for Italian Big Mouth." He understood the plight of ethnic people, not just Italians, but of ethnic people coming to this country, and how hard it was for them to get a start and to get a foothold when you were dealing with people that, you know, were the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant established people. We were in Philadelphia for an argument, and we would walk from the hotel to the courthouse, and we'd walk by this one building, and one day I said to him, "What is that?" He said, "Well, that's a building that you and I can't enter." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, it's the Union League." Sort of something like the Duquesne Club here. I said, "What's that?" He says, "Well, that's a club that would not admit me as a member because I'm Italian. It would not admit you as a member because of your ethnicity as Lebanese." And you know, what a thing to think about. And fast forward 30 years, I'm on the board of the Pennsylvania Bar Association. I'm in Philadelphia for a meeting, and one of my buddies is a member there, and we walk in the front door, you know, after 30 years. So it's not only that they wouldn't allow him to be a member there, they wouldn't want him to be a guest there either.
When he needed a law clerk, rather than going through an elaborate process of receiving resumes, he'd make a phone call to John Shulo or to Nick Fisfis or any number of people, Ray Sekula, and ask for a recommendation. And it just so happened that there were a lot of Duquesne people coming through. I think the fact that he was the dean of our law school, he continued to teach at the law school, really made an impression on him that he was going to take care of the Duquesne people over the years.
His bias was always in favor of the people. He wanted to, if he was interpreting something and it was a gray line area or it was a close call, the people got the call from him, not the government, not the corporation, the people.
I remember vividly one time when we were driving to Harrisburg, and I believe he was on the Supreme Court then, and there was a car full of young male African Americans driving by. And Lou, there was a state police car, and the state police car, Lou observed, stopped the car with African American young men in it. And Lou insisted, he went right up to the state trooper and insisted on knowing why the car was stopped, what the violation was. There was no speeding. He was not going to let this happen. He was not going to let it go.
He asked me where I wanted to go, what law firm I wanted to go to, and I told him I'd been doing a lot of research, and I decided that there was a law firm in Pittsburgh, Berkman, Russlander, Pohl, Lieber, and Engel, and I was going to contact them. And he asked me, "Well, that's a great firm, but how did you end up selecting that firm?" But if you go back 40 or 50 years ago, we still had remnants of discrimination in large law firms, not only against minorities and women, but Italians. And I couldn't find many Italian names that were partners in the major law firms. And Berkman Russlander not only had several, they were primarily at that time a Jewish law firm, and I thought, boy, if there's any group that are not going to discriminate, it would be this particular law firm. And I was right. When I went to work there, they were open to everyone. We had women in the firm, we had blacks in the firm, we had Italians in the firm, and it was nice.
I walked into the library, and immediately coming down the steps, I see almost a life-size picture of him, and I stopped in my tracks. I couldn't believe it. It looked just like him. It was like him standing there. It just stopped me dead, and it was very emotional, actually, because I miss him to this day.
Justice Louis L. Mandarino had worked as a professor, a dean, a judge, and then served as a Democratic Pennsylvania Supreme Court justice from 1972 until his death in 1979, 1 week before his 50th birthday. Justice Mandarino died of a heart attack. His brother, James J. Mandarino, was working equally hard, representing Westmoreland County's 58th District as a Democrat in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, having been elected for the first time in November of 1966. Jim was re-elected to serve for 11 more terms.
In many ways, though people think of him with a lot of achievements, deep down inside he was a very humble person. So he didn't talk much about his roots or expectations. But I do think that there was really a sense of feeling blessed by the potential opportunity that was offered here in the States, and the idea of the American dream, that you can be whatever you want to be and work hard and make something of yourself. And in each way, I think each of the siblings did that. I think with Dad and Uncle Lou, their path was public service, and their path was one that took them more into the public eye. But for them, I think it was service that really mattered. You know, the difference that I can make in my community's life, the difference I can make in the citizen's life.
Jim understood that instinctively because of his roots in Monessen. He understood the trauma that people were living through, and he knew that as a legislator and as a leader that he had to begin to tackle that. So very few people in southwestern Pennsylvania at any elected level are more responsible for beginning to lift up that region and give it hope and provide jobs. Very few people can say they did as much as Jim Mandarino to begin to rescue people, literally rescue them from a life of hopelessness, a life of trauma, and a life of real pain that so many families were experiencing.
I can still see this guy getting up from his chair, walking back the aisle with his glasses down here and looking at members as why they're not voting the way they should be, you know. And Jim, even though the majority leader shouldn't do that, the minority whip, and the reason why they call it the whip, he whips the members in the line, and that's basically where the whip position comes from, to make sure the votes are there. But boy, when you saw this massive man walk down the aisle towards you, you were like, uh-oh, I think he's coming to see me. You knew he was coming to see you, you know. And bottom line was, because of the leader he was, and because he put you first in the way he approached his job as a leader, my rank and file members make me the leader. I need to make sure that the rank and file members are up to par on whatever they needed, you know. And you knew that when he came back, and he knew when he left his seat, that he would eventually get your vote, because he wasn't going back until you got it. And the joy of Jim, you know, there were a few, and I was probably part of that group too, on occasion, that would just hang out with a red light instead of a green light, you know, to support what he wanted, just to see if he would start to move out of that chair and come back towards you, and all of a sudden you would switch your vote over to green and save him the trip.
I think it was Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. When the editorial board asked me who I thought was the most influential elected official in Harrisburg, and I said naturally Jim Mandarino, because not because he was Italian or anything, because of the fact he was. I mean, he got more done under a Republican governor than anybody. And they said, you know, prior to you coming in 2 weeks ago, we had Governor Thornburg come in. He said the same thing.
Because of Jim's extraordinary abilities as a leader, he was elected to be the House floor leader 4 times.
He was the great compromiser. I mean, he knew that if you couldn't get the whole loaf of bread, he'd take a half a loaf. And he was good at negotiating.
One time, he was very angry at a political labor leader, and this story just popped back into my mind. And he was so mad at him that he didn't think that he could transmit the message that he wanted to transmit, so he put me in charge of doing that. And it was going to be kind of tough. And so I walked back to my office, got this person's phone number, took a couple of deep breaths to call them and chew them out. And this was a very prominent person, you know, and I was going to have to say, the boss is really mad at you. And he doesn't like this, and he doesn't like that, and he doesn't like this about what you did. I had made some mental notes, and then I'd written them down before I started to dial him. And I was just getting ready to call him, and the door flew open, and Jim came in and said, and another thing, he said, make sure you leave him the narrowest possible bridge to walk back to us on.
They respected each other. There was none of this Democrat, Republican. I mean, it was a little of that, but not as much as it is now. There wasn't partisanship. Jim talked to the Republicans. The Republicans needed something. They went to Jim, and then when we got out of the majority, it was the same thing. They had a great deal of respect. Like I told you, Governor Thornburg he got more out of Governor Thornburg than his own party did. You don't see that today. And I had these guys coming in today they didn't have the opportunity to work with a great statesman like Jim Mandarino.
He was tough, having grown up in politics and grown up in a circumstance where he had to work to get ahead. But he also had a great passion for people. He had an innate understanding, a natural understanding of what people were up against when they lost a job, because he lived in a community where that happened. Jim Mandarino, in so many ways, was not just a great example of a strong Democratic leader, but it was a great example of what it means to be a bipartisan legislator. That led to the work that he did even before my father was elected. He was working with Governor Thornburg on these same issues, even as he probably opposed him on other issues.
That would have been in the summer of 1976 when I won the primary and came up to Harrisburg, and I met all the officials, and of course I met Jim at that time. That would have been my first meeting with him. We were paisans. They called him, of course, the Rock of Monessen, which fit him perfectly because his beliefs, he stuck to them, and he did not desert his people. He stayed true.
I saw him do something very dramatic on the floor of the House one time. The Democratic caucus had approximately 20 African Americans in it most of the time that he was leader. And welfare issues used to get a racial overtone. There was a debate going on one time, I remember, with a very prominent leader of the Philadelphia caucus. And there was buzz and there was negativity, and Jim actually interrupted him. And he called like a recess for a minute or two, and he stepped to the podium, and he told them that his family had been on welfare. And he described a story of being a little kid, and welfare in his era was essentially surplus food. And he could very well remember taking a little cart with his brother Lou and going down to get surplus food for the Mandarino family. He shut a lot of people up. George Will once said, America is a place where you become an American by declaring, I am an American. And in a lot of ways, there is no other nation in the world that's like us because they all have elements of what are called blood and soil, which is, well, no, you can't be whatever you want to be. You can't be Croatian, you can't be a Pole, you can't be an Italian because you don't come from generations of people who've lived in this particular village, who own this land. You don't have our blood. And so blood and soil issues have defined concepts of citizenship. So for a guy like me, who's the child of first generation, I'm a first generation American and my parents were immigrants, and a guy like Jimmy, his parents were immigrants, we all share a common experience of literally becoming Americans and identifying with America. And it becomes part of you. It's a defining thing. And when you get into politics, it becomes a base of strength and a base of common identity. You are, I would say Jimmy's been long gone, but if he were alive now, he'd be very admonitory about people pulling up the ladder after themselves and saying basically, yeah, well, we made it, my people made it, but not your people. And well, what's wrong with you? Well, they happen to be, in most instances, brown. And Jimmy never would have bought that.
Come with me, we put the Italian caucus together in the back of his van. We mimeographed that front page story. We came back and we signed up almost 80 members that day. And it's been going on. I guess it's, we started in about 84, something like that. Joe was the chairman at that time, and we used to have, was just to promote our nationality. Jim come from a Menneson where it's all people, I mean, all working people in that area. He came from the people. And I think it's a great tribute to him is the fact that he never forgot where he came from.
My name's Daly. That was anglicized because my grandfather and my father, my dad was born in Italy, came here and they couldn't get a job because they were Italians, and Italians were prejudiced against. And my grandfather changed his name from Francesco D'Elia to Frank Daly. He had a photographic memory. I've never seen anybody that could spit up so many figures, accurate figures. And what I did was, because I didn't believe it, he was that good, I kept the figures. Whenever I knew he was going to debate something on a certain budget item, and he would right down to the penny.
And I think it was a tough vote. I was only in here about my second term. And everybody's hiding because nobody wants to do this vote. And so me and my colleague who served with me, we're hiding on it. I used to be up on the third floor. We're hiding, you know. And Ivan Itkin comes up and says, "Come on, guys." He says, "The speaker and the leader want to see you." Rich Kusunik says, "You want to put handcuffs on us?" You know? He said, so we go down there. And Jim says, "I need you guys' vote." And I said, "I can't vote for it." And the Speaker Irvis says, "Come on, you guys got to, you know, what can we do for your districts?" I said, "Mr. Irvis, you can't do anything for my district. I ain't voting for it." Well, Rich comes up to Jim, one of us anyhow, and Rich says, "I can use a bridge." And Jimmy said, "We're all out of bridges. Get out of here."
I'm a student of education, and I'm thinking to myself, no one's that smart. How can he be that smart? He always told me, you never give everybody what they want. You give them what they need. You make sure that if it's like the teachers union or the Teamsters or the steelworkers, whoever it was, when we're doing union stuff, it's union stuff. But if you give them everything, they'll never come back to you.
Jim's career would culminate in him being elected in 1989 as the 133rd Speaker of the House, which is the oldest statewide elected office in Pennsylvania. Jim Mandarino's portrait will forever hang in the Pennsylvania Capitol, just down the hall from the portrait of another American patriot, Benjamin Franklin, who held the same position in 1764. Like his brother Lou, Jim would die unexpectedly of a heart attack at the age of 57 in his home in Menneson the morning after Christmas.
I had gone through a divorce in 1989, And I had a problem at Thanksgiving time with seeing my children. So made arrangements that Christmas would be different, and my wife, ex-wife, would cooperate with that. And it must have been on Jim's mind, because at 11 o'clock Christmas evening, Jim Mandarino called me and said, "Pete, I just want to know how your Christmas went. Did you get to see the children?" I said, "Jim, it was perfect." And you know, when Kathy was retiring, his daughter was retiring from the House of Representatives, we had lunch together. And I said, "You know, Kathy, I'll never forget the kindness that Jim did by taking time out of his Christmas day and calling me about how the situation was at Christmas for me." And she goes, "Oh my God." He went into the kitchen at 11 o'clock and made a phone call, came out with a smile on his face. Until right now, I never knew who he called. And yet, he wanted to make sure, and then a few hours later, the man was dead. That was Jim Mandarino, a little man with a big heart from a little city. I remember on the day of his funeral, there was a couple buses that left Harrisburg to go to the funeral. And we pulled in to Monessen. And one of the members said, "Oh my God, I can't believe what I'm looking at." I said, "Well, what's the problem?" And he said, "I thought these streets would be lined with gold. Jim was the leader." And I said, "Well, you didn't know him very well."
The night after the viewing, the evening before the funeral, a number of us were out in Monessen and stayed at the same hotel, of course. So we're in the cocktail lounge, and Mr. Hayden asked me, "So which of his children are going to be next to be in politics?" And I said, "Well, probably any of them, but I think the number one would be Kathy."
Her interest in and willingness to run for public office in the other end of the state, meaning in Philadelphia, where she would have had a natural political advantage to stay home, I think is her willingness to do that and her courage and fortitude to run for office in another part of the state where she might not have had the same advantages. So, I guess, can I say in a word, so Mandarino.
Kathy Mandarino followed in the footsteps of her father, serving the 194th District in the Pennsylvania House from 1993 to 2010. She was appointed by Governor Tom Wolf to serve on his cabinet as the Secretary of Labor and Industry. Stepping down in 2017, she went on to become a commissioner on the state's gaming board, with some hoping she would become Pennsylvania's first female governor.
The whole point of coming to the United States is because it's the land of opportunity. So why not shoot for the stars? And I think that when you have a family that emphasizes that and that raises you with the expectation that, well, here we've come to this new country in order to be able to have access to these opportunities, if you then have a child that has that drive, I don't see why they wouldn't be able to reach those heights.
The Mandarino family it's a great American story, a great American success story of two brothers born into an immigrant family that achieved so much in that first generation.
In fact, all the Italians that came across, they knew when they were here, they had to work to make a go of it.
Yep. The most wonderful people God ever created, Italian people. I'm sorry if you're not Italian, I like you, but they're the best.